For everyone with an interest in MASH, or more broadly, steatotic liver disease, Surf's Up, Season 5, Episode 19 of Surfing the MASH Tsunami, our conversations during the meeting with Mike Betel, Louise Campbell, and Sven Francque starts now.
Today, on Surfing the MASH Tsunami.
Over the coming years, irrespective of these guidelines, we have a tsunami of cirrhosis coming. We have a tsunami of decompensation coming. A lot of the evidence in some of the abstracts was that the fastest progressing group are from compensated to decompensated.
Usually you ask me what was my key takeaway, so I'll just jump to that. I was struck by the challenges that patients are having around the world, really, about getting the time and the concern.
What's interesting is the amount of conversations we're having about AI and looking at how to detect the populations quicker, but we don't have capacity in most areas to actually find. Once we found what we're going to do with it, we can find them quicker. How do you manage them?
You see impressive results on MASH resolution. You see results that are quite suggestive of a clear effect on fibrosis also. And then we have also the previous data with lanifibranor also showing a strong anti-fibrotic effect in 24 weeks time. So there are a lot of potential drugs in the pipeline.
As often as I quoted our friend Stephen as saying that liver is the canary in the coal mine, it's a little bit different. That in fact, metabolic disease is like the great fog, and it's liver, and it's diabetes, and it's obesity, and the causes of death will be cardiovascular and extrahepatic cancers, obesogenic cancers, if you will.
Last week, over 7,000 hepatology stakeholders convened in Milano for the EASL Congress 2024. This week, listen to one-on-one conversations that pricing and forecasting guru Roger Green conducted with patient advocate and Fatty Liver Alliance founder and president Mike Betel, liver wellness advocate and co-host Louise Campbell, and hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Sven Francque, all on the days of the Congress, today, on a special Surfing the MASH Tsunami.
Remember to stay tuned after this episode for this week's question of the week.
Hi, this is Roger Green, co-host of the Surfing the MASH Tsunami podcast. As the dust settles after the EASL Congress, we're lining up episodes on the topics listeners have asked about. The three clear leading topics are the drug development studies, the updated CPG guidelines, and the Healthy Liver, Healthy Lives initiative. We're posting the Healthy Liver, Healthy Lives episode on July 3rd. We're looking to post the other two topics sometime later this month or maybe the week of July 10th. This week, we've linked together 4 conversations I had with individuals during the Congress itself to make an episode. First, the conversation with Mike Betel from the Fatty Liver Alliance on the first day he was in town about the first day's event and the general tone in Milan. Then 2 conversations with Louise, one discussing the Thursday sessions and the second mostly Friday. Finally, Sven Francque joins me to discuss clinical drug development, the updated clinical practice guidelines, and other points of interest. Over the rest of the month, as I mentioned, we plan episodes covering some of the most exciting presentations and topics from the meeting. For those of you who did not attend, let this week be your appetizer. For those who did, again, I'd love to hear more from you about what you'd like us to talk about and your observations on how what we say this week aligns with your own thoughts or varies from them. And with that, here's my discussion with Mike Betel from the Fatty Liver Institute. Hi there, this is Roger. So if you've read our newsletter this week or you saw my short video clip the other day, you know 2 things. Number one, I'm not in Milano. Everything that I was concerned about that would keep me from getting to Milano kept me from getting there, but it all went really well. So life is good, except that sadly, I'm not in Milano where I really want to be, number one. And then number 2 is that we're going to try to reach out to some of our friends over the course of the week and do some one-on-one or one-on-2 interviews so that we can give you a flavor of what it's actually like to be there. And then, of course, I'll be talking later in the week about our follow-up episodes next week and the week after. But our first conversation from Milano, not surprisingly, is with Mike Betel, who spends more time on audio and video than just about anybody I know and is really good at it. So, hey, Mike, how are you today?
Hey, tutto bene. Buongiorno. How's that to start the day?
Molto bene, amico. Come stai?
Molto bene.
We're all proving that we don't speak Italian. I speak a tiny bit of Italian. Mike's totally bluffing, although I believe is it Toronto that has more Italian speakers than any city in the world outside of Italy? Italy?
Yeah, well, there is a huge Italian community. Actually, funny, really quick story. Back in, I would say 1994 or something like that, I got invited to go to Bologna by Dr. Stefano Berlanti and to talk about the internet. I ran a website called HepNet, and it was the world's first hepatitis website. Anyway, so I memorized my whole intro in Italian, and I did it so well, and I practiced it. I had all of it down, that after I finished, I switched to English, of course, and they all looked at me like they had no idea what I was saying. So it was perfect. It was perfect, but it kind of backfired at the end of the day. But
At any rate, tell our audience a little bit about the meeting in general and what it feels like, and then a little bit about what you did today and what you learned that they'd want to know.
For me, I kind of thrive in this environment. And so, although at two of the talks, I couldn't sit in the front row because there was reserve signs on it. So anyway, with respect to the organizers, they should save me a seat. But anyway, so I love doing this and I love sharing information back. So it's been really exciting. And, you can feel the excitement in the air. I think people they were lined up. I came early, as usual. And so I was here probably about 20 minutes before the doors even opened. And there was already people outside waiting to get in. So got my registration badges. So the first presentation that I went to at 8:30 was with Shira, and we were co-chairing, and that was a really great way to start. And you know what? The room was completely full.
Wow. So how big was the room, and what were you talking about?
I'm actually talking to you right now from the exact same rooms. There's probably 150 chairs in here. I'll give you the official description so that I don't mess it up. But the session was providing a specialized forum for patients and patient advocates, physicians, and allied health professionals to come together, so we're all together in the room, to discuss the barriers and potential solutions for addressing unmet needs in clinical settings. Physicians and patient advocates alike will speak about patient experiences, health systems, integrated care, community services, and collaborative strategies to tackling unmet needs. We led the discussion, and there was 6 speakers altogether, and then we had a Q&A after. We didn't even have to use our pre-planned questions because there was so much interest from the audience. So the first talk, I'll just give you the topics just to give you an idea. So Professor Vincenza Calvaruso spoke about improving patient experience and challenges initiatives from the AISF perspective.
AISF, what does that mean?
AISF is the Italian Association for the Study of Liver, and so it really should be IASF.
Well, no, actually,
AISF.
given the way you just opened this conversation in Italian, it would be Associazione Italiana for whatever.
There you go.
Yeah, there you go.
So that was a great question on your part, and I don't know why it was backwards, but now I understand why.
Hint to the audience, Mike comes from Canada, but he's not really much of a Francophone either, because my guess is the French would have reversed it also. Go ahead.
I was horrible in learning French in school, actually, but every year they brought me to the next year anyway. Roberto Perez Gallo talked about strengthening community-based HCV services and people-centered harm reduction. So that was like HCV-based and some of the challenges that they've had. Then George Constantinou, that was really interesting for me because I didn't really know a lot about thalassemia. His talk was about essential integration of liver disease in the multidisciplinary care of patients with, and I had trouble saying it live too, but hemoglobinopathies. Yeah, that was pretty good.
I'm impressed.
Milan, my friend from ELPA, the director of ELPA, talked about patient experiences in using health services and the availability of health services. Josie Williams talked about unmet patient needs and what needs to change in the doctor's office. And following that was the perfect match for that particular discussion point was Dr. Thomas Margett, and he spoke about challenges and opportunities for meeting patient needs in the doctor's office. So it was a good selection of topics. Usually you ask me what was my key takeaway, so I'll just jump to that.
Yeah, good.
For me, I was struck by the challenges that patients are having around the world, really, about getting the time and the concern, gently I say concern because I know doctors care, but they're very busy most often, and so getting the time from the doctors to really take an interest in that particular patient's story, because every patient is different. And there was a feeling that was shared by a number of the speakers that if they had more time to spend with the doctors, they could explain more and get more tailored care.
Interesting.
So I did think that was quite interesting as well.
But first of all, I'm sure that's right. I mean, when you say that there was a belief among the speakers, I just think that intuitively makes all the sense in the world. They talk about the art of healing, and a lot of it's based on what you hear and what you touch. So if you're not touching anymore and you're not listening anymore because you don't have the time to listen and you don't have to touch because you got all these devices and tools and care enablers, all that goes out the window, right?
Well, Josie told me a story that she went in front of a doctor once, and the doctor was typing and typing and typing while she was talking. And the doctor said, "Go on, I'm listening." And she said, "But you're not hearing what I'm saying." So
Bang.
you could be listening, but not actually hearing. And so I thought that was pretty powerful.
Yeah, bang. That's right. That's right.
We also talked a lot about stigma, which is a common discussion point in the patient advocacy world in so many areas, with the obesity and liver disease as two discussion points too. And I asked the question of the panel, well, what can we do to empower patients to have the confidence to actually say, if it happens in front of their physician, to say to the doctor, what you just said to me made me feel stigmatized or hurt my feelings or whatever they want to say. And the panel agreed that it would be good. And Thomas, the physician, said that he totally agreed. And he would learn more by a patient saying that to them once, the shock of it, than an entire weekend on stigma at a symposium.
That makes a ton of sense for a variety of reasons. I think of conversations with our good friend Tony Vigliotti about his primary care doctor never took fatty liver for granted once again after Tony's transplant.
Yeah.
Because he knew.
It's just about understanding that we're all patients, and if we're not patients, hopefully we're never a patient, but we're going to be a patient with something, or our family will be. And so just recognize that we want to be treated the way that we should be treating other people, right?
Well, I think that's part of it. And the rest of it is experiential learning and empathy, right? I mean, they don't teach empathy in med school.
Yeah.
But, to the degree that you're going to be empathic, you're going to be empathic because you're going to respond to what you live through.
Agreed.
That sounds like a fantastic session.
So I really enjoyed that. And Shira said I did a great job, which is good because it was my first one that I've done at EASL. So I said, put me down for next year. I'm in. So hopefully they invite me back.
Well, I'm sure they will, Mike. So beyond that session, what else have you seen today that you think this audience would like to hear about?
There was a really good, I went to a couple industry sessions so far. Don't forget the meeting really just started. There was a couple industry.
The meeting hasn't really started, right? The opening session was today, but the first general session is tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning is when they really kick off content and abstract sessions and general session and all that stuff.
The EASL opening, Alexander Krog and a few other people, I thought it was very passionately shared about the future of liver health, really throughout Europe and really globally as well. And Jeff Lazarus also had a chance to speak, and so I just thought that was a really good opening. So I enjoyed that component of it. I started to mention before there was a couple industry ones I went to. MSD had a talk. Arun Sanyal and Elisabetta Buginasi, I hope I pronounced it, Buginasi. Yeah, at Yorn.
And Yorn,
and Frank, right? I think it's pronounced Take from Germany.
Frank
I said, nice to meet you. And he said, I'm Frank Take from Germany.
Right.
So that was nice. And so they went through, the title was F is for fibrosis, spelling out the issues in advanced MASH. They asked us not to take photos or share anything, so I couldn't do that, but I did at least take pictures of the speakers and share those. But that was enjoyable. And you'll be pleased to know that Louise Campbell spoke there was an EchoSense industry talk, and she presented. I posted that, I shared that as well, and it was really nice to see. She came to see me, and then I went to see her, so that worked out. That worked out nice this morning.
Very nice. Yeah, we'll be catching up with Louise probably tomorrow. Mike sent me pictures of him with Yorn, and then Louise speaking as a way of telling me they missed me. I probably miss you more, but
Oh, that's so nice. And Jorn actually asked me, you think it's okay to send the pictures, or is that going to make him feel worse that he missed it? And I said, no, let's send him the pictures. Tell him he missed it.
Yeah, well, no, that was great. So anything else in this brief little interlude you want people to know about your day or about this meeting?
I would just say the same thing that we talk about after every conference like this. The networking opportunities is incredible. I've already had like 4 individual meetings with different people and organizations that would like to collaborate, and that's what EASL is supposed to be about. Is about developing relationships and collaborating so that we can share more and make a bigger impact in patient care. That's how I see it.
Now you're frustrating me, but that's right. I totally agree.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. I'm just teasing. Just teasing.
We didn't get to have our cappuccino together.
No, we didn't get to have our cappuccino together, and I probably am sitting here with 35 invitations to talk to people while I'm there that I'm not going to get to see. So I'm trying to set those up for the rest of the month.
You know what? It wasn't that windy here, so you would have had a better hair day than last time.
For those who do not know that story, Mike and I shot a video last year outside of the meeting hall in Vienna where it was so windy that the hair that I do have kept getting blown away as it exposed all the hair that I don't have. And it was one of the worst hair days I've ever had in my life. It's certainly the worst hair day I've ever had on video, but good to share it with a friend.
That was the best laugh I had. I'm still laughing about it. At your expense, I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. So, Mike, I do have one more question for you.
Yeah.
Today, of all days, Lilly released their phase 2 tirzepatide results that showed a significant, what looks like, although very, very different placebo levels. Basically, in the tirzepatide phase 2, and I've only seen the headline on this, there was about a 50% one-level reduction in fibrosis versus 25 in the placebo group, which would make it more efficacious in reducing fibrosis than resmetirom. I'm wondering if you've heard anything from anybody about it.
No, not yet. I would have expected something like that maybe at the late breaker on the last day.
Well, they released it outside the context of the meeting. I know what the late breakers are, and the late breakers are embargoed until an hour before the presentation.
Right. So, no, I haven't seen anything, and I've been literally running from one session to another.
Okay.
So if I see something, I will say something.
Well, actually, it's more like if you hear something. I'm wondering if it's something anybody's going to be talking about.
Okay. I love spending time with you and your audience, and thank you for always asking.
And thanks for spending the time, and we'll catch a piece of virtual high-quality pizza when you're in Toronto, and I'm wherever. Okay? Take care, friend. See you soon. Bye-bye now. My first conversation with my esteemed co-host, Louise Campbell, took place after the Congress closed down on Thursday. Enjoy. We're chatting with Louise Campbell, our co-host, good friend, around since episode 3, has presented 5 hours so far at this meeting and is now acting like what she is in real life, which is an amazingly interested liver advocate. How's Milano treating you?
It's lovely. There's a really, really nice vibe. It's quite exciting. I think, obviously, there's a sadness with the loss of Stephen. He's all over the posters. He's all over the presentations. His name's everywhere. So he's a great miss and loss, and I think that hasn't gone unnoticed throughout the conference. But the actual general vibe in Milan is very positive. Lots of good sessions, lots of good interactions with people. And now I've finished my commitments to the program, I can actually get to enjoy it myself.
Have you gotten to enjoy any of it so far?
I went to the patient advocate sessions yesterday morning, so the first morning, bright and early, which Michael Betel and Shira were presenting, which was actually a really, really good kickoff to the conference from my perspective, and a lot of people in the room, and it started it so positively. The room was packed. There were sessions from Jose Villements from the Dutch patient liver program in what patients want for their questions from the doctors. There was then a doctor from Oxford who then presented the opposite side of what a doctor thinks they should be asking in their clinic and what they know the patient is coming in about the car parking and bits and pieces. And together those two were very, very entertaining. And I certainly hope that we can probably do something with the two of them and ourselves and get them to redo that, because it was very entertaining, and how their slides were prepared differently but covered a lot of the same perspective. So there was a bit of humour in the room with that. There was some discussion on stigma that just took off naturally about stigma that sort of generated a lot of discussion. Donna Cry got up, I said a few things, because what was missing in the session from my perspective was there was no middle ground on the nurses spend more time with patients, for example, to answer a lot of the questions about health, how it's going to affect me, ask the questions that they want to ask. So it was a really positive kickoff to the entire conference, and everybody was buzzing coming out of that session, and I think they did a great job.
Well, that's fantastic. Mike talked a little bit about that on our phone call with him. He felt the same.
And there was a take home from it. Jose was saying that every person in health should ask their patients at least once a year, how does your liver disease affect you? Even if it's only asked once a year, then to take home that message that we must be asking this question, whether you're nurses, whether you're doctors, whether you're allied health dietitians, how does it affect you? That was a really powerful statement, and I think it's something we can all do. Remember to do that.
So that acts in the presumption that everybody knows how it affects them, or maybe they don't know and haven't thought about the question and you're triggering it for the first time.
But I think it shows that insight that you're wanting to know as a physician, as a nurse, and you're trying to find out. The assumption sometimes can be that how are you feeling? And a lot of people will say fine. My father's a perfect example of fine. And I go, all right, before the doctor's almost out the door, rate fine between 0 and 10. Oh, 5. Then the doctor turns around. So sometimes you have to prompt that question and you have to ask it in the right way. And I think that's what, for me, Jose was saying, put liver in the title. How does your liver health affect you? Not just how are you? To be specific, really get that into that nitty gritty and open up the dialogue.
So that sounds exceptionally interesting. I'm curious. So did you get to the general session today at all?
I got to the end of the general session. I was there for the sort of look at VCTE and its predictive value. So I was there for that discussion and how it can predict the outcomes. The majority of patients there were Asia Pacific, and they are doing a sub-analysis of Asia Pacific versus the Western populations because they're markedly different. Interesting enough for me, Asia Pacific was very strong, but there was no Australian part of Asia Pacific in the study groups that were utilised. But that seemed to be a fairly robust study looking at sort of 2 scans, the out measurements and how that altered. But I'm still digesting and all of the finer detail because you know how much you take in and you just go, let me get that right before I say that was thing. But it was a very positive outcome about how predictive you can be with these machines.
Well, good. Save that for the wrap-up episode.
I went over to the Novo Nordisk Symposia, which was an absolutely excellent and fascinating session. It was hosted by Quentin Henkhuzi and a lady physician whose name escapes me at the moment from Denmark. And they were excellent, but they were looking at managing cardiometabolic, using the livers to manage the cardiometabolic side rather than focusing on liver disease.
Okay, so did you give them a standing ovation at the end, since I know you believe strongly in the importance of doing that?
I did see Quentin a little bit later and said I thought it was a fantastic effort and exactly where we need to be sitting, that with certainly in primary healthcare, because that's where everybody foresees this being managed in the future. I'm not too sure how many primary care physicians are aware of that, given the volume and the numbers we are talking about, but that was where the prediction was in 5 years' time. I think they said that this would all be, the majority of cases would be all in primary care. So therefore, Ken and the team were looking at this whole thing, managing from a diabetic and endocrinology perspective and managing liver disease. But therefore, you weren't managing the liver disease so much if you were looking at reducing the cardiometabolic, improving the health and assessing all of those areas early in steatotic liver disease. So whilst it was a Novo Nordisk Symposia, it wasn't a Novo Nordisk focused event. And I think that was, again, the positive of some of the symposia. It was not biased towards semaglutide nor any of the products. None of I think there was a couple of slides on Sema and their outcomes, but a lot of it was how do we manage this? How do we liaise? We're looking at cardiovascular outcomes. We need to prevent very much further upstream. And I do, if I could have got my pom-poms out, shaking them around the room and things like that, then I would have done, because I think that is where we are heading.
Yeah, although to do that, you would have had to been able to do high kicks, and with your knee, I suspect high kicks are still out of the question, yeah?
Well, it's kicking up 16,000 steps a day, but it's doing its exercises as well. But yes.
Well, bravo, that's fantastic. Good for you.
And then the last session I did today was the Healthy Livers, Healthy Lives presentation, where Zabir presented some very startling figures about where we're heading cost-wise in the US, not only in healthcare, but in the loss of productivity in it and to industry. And I'm a great advocate that a lot of this has to be done in tandem with employers as to their workforce and things like that. But Jeff Lazarus was there, WHO were there. They were looking at the Indian targets and how India has addressed fatty liver disease with 300 million, again, on their population expected to be problematic. So, again, that was based on the work that they'd done a few years ago.
So it strikes me just from that we've known that India was out ahead of everybody else for a while in terms of policy. Well, also maybe derivatively because they had a drug faster than anybody else did, or a drug that they believed would work faster than anybody else did. And first thought. And second thought is you taught me about presenteeism back in 2021. Or 2020. It's something people had to be looking at. So it's good to hear that's starting to get to focus, and delightful that WHO was there. Yeah, I think Zabir put it, and of course he flashed through slides and lots of data, but I think if you, what they were doing was breaking down the productivity by fibrosis scale. For example, the productivity, I've just pulled up the figures here, was $18,000 per patient in 2021. And these are just startling figures. When you go up to 2040, we're talking in the region of $258,000 in productivity loss per patient. Per patient at what level? You said it changed by fibrosis level, so I'm assuming that the 258 was a higher level and the 18 was a lower level. And NASH F0 was $4,109 productivity cost per person. At stage 0, F1, again, was the same. It didn't actually change until you actually hit NASH fibrosis 3 to $4,237. So it's very static, but it's still $4,000 productivity loss per person. Now, for small businesses, that's massive. But again, it's more of a global look and what the prediction is. But these are mass figures, so therefore it's difficult. But yeah, we were looking
looking at India as a target, and the way that they had shifted it, if I remember correctly, because people look at just liver disease, as we've discussed, and liver mortality rather than all-cause mortality, and therefore it's low on the agenda. And my intake out the session was that was what the WHO were sort of demonstrating, that it doesn't hit high on the agenda. It's kept in that liver area. But India used the target that 39%, I think he said, and apologies if I'm wrong, of patients with diabetes would develop liver cancer in India. And that was when the Indian government made a change. We cannot allow 30% of people with a condition to die of liver cancer. So I had to leave, but there was stimulated a discussion about maybe using a different mechanism to trigger the right outcomes that we want. And obviously cancer is a very important area for that. But again, plenty of studies showing all-cause mortality in low fibrosis scores is still higher than liver-related mortality higher up. So there's some interesting stuff to come. There's some very interesting abstracts I've scanned through that I'm hoping to get back to spend more time on and replay some of those.
So I'm listening to you, and part of my reaction is, I think I said this last week on the preview episode, and if I didn't, I was thinking it, and I'll say it now. Liver has really become like the six blind people and the elephant. You just described 2 days focused entirely on patient-centric issues and patient impact, except for the one VCTE study. At the same time that there are major presentations on all kinds of things. I think the drug stuff I think denifenstat was the only drug today. There'll be drugs in the general session tomorrow. There'll be a bunch of stuff in the late breaker, including, it seemed to me that Lilly jumped the gun. Lilly released results yesterday on the study that I believe is being presented here that shows that they have a significant impact on fibrosis, tirzepatide. They said 51% one level reduction versus 25 with placebo.
And I believe MASLD made a press release this afternoon about the data that's been used at EASL, but I haven't had time to read it.
I've not yet either. I'm trying to catch up with the stuff as best I can, but it's a little bit challenging from here. I miss you guys. I miss being there.
You would love it, and we miss you being here, because everybody asks when I walk past them.
Happily, what I'm home for is going as well as it could possibly go. So at least that's the good news. My time is well spent. We joked last week on the preview about the need to clone Hannes, because there's actually one moment in this meeting where Karolinska is doing 2 presentations of his stuff at once, and he obviously can't do both of them. Yes. So this was a week I would have loved to have been cloned.
Well, I'm hoping the vibe from here goes into AASLD. Later in the year, because I think I do get a sense of motion. I was talking to Alina Allen as we left the Healthy Liver, Healthy Life session, and she felt the same way, that there's a general movement forward, there's a lot of enthusiasm in the room, and it's that progression. We might be saying the same thing next year, but I certainly hope that the work that we're seeing here is interesting as some of these abstracts are very positive.
Look, I think in general, the approval of Rezdiffra, the movement of drugs later, and the compelling epidemiologic and health economic data is forcing everybody to look harder. We have to. When we called this podcast Tsunami 5 years ago, we did it for a completely different reason. Pache Stephen, but it's just the global consequences are massive.
What's interesting is the amount of conversations we're having about AI and looking at how to detect the populations quicker, but we don't have capacity in most areas to actually, once we've found them, what we're going to do with them, we can find them quicker. How do you manage them? I had the pleasure to speak to Simon Strasser, a consultant that I'd worked with in Australia, in the Royal Prince Alfred in Sydney, because she's over here with some of the Australians. And when we were discussing the Australians can be quite touchy about their medical records and whether or not some of the patients would turn around and say, well, if you did a screening AI screen of their bloods and things like that, how did you get my records? Who gave you permission? So this whole thing of confidentiality, and I did see it when I was in Australia, that there may be issues that we don't see in, say, the UK or the US that we would need to adapt for in countries like Australia. I'm sure they take care of all of those as you go into different environments. And in fact, I know they do, because you're going to do all of that. But it's an interesting take, but there's a lot more of that. Now we've got something, let's start to find those populations, and how do we do it? So I'm definitely getting that feel.
So just to recap for those who didn't hear last week's episode, I think the biggest theme of the preview episode was the shift in focus from excitement about developing individual drugs in small studies to what we could learn from larger data consortia. What brings that to mind in this moment is Hannes, one of the 2 Karolinska papers that are on at the same time, takes a look at the ability of FIB4 to predict and the high level of false negatives false positives, and that you can actually do better than that with an algorithm constructed basically, if I remember correctly, ALT, AST, GGT, gender, age. Those 5 things are a better screening predictor than FIB4 is, So then you get to the issue that goes, where in the world are they doing ALTs as a standard metric? Or at least where are they doing them on standard on all diabetic patients, right? Since the correlations are so high. That would be issue number 1. And then issue number 2 would be, and after that, what are you going to do? Primary care is underinformed. Hepatology is under-resourced. It's going to create interesting challenges. But the good news, though, is the quality of discussion is so much higher.
Yes, people are having those discussions now. It is probably easier to case find quicker than it is to change and stop the Titanic in healthcare to get them to make a decision. And that takes years of business cases to increase capacity of staff, types of staff. So we do need to, whilst we're looking at trying to solve the solutions of poor liver health, stopping disease, going way further upstream to treat earlier, to save costs, to improve care, we also need to be in tandem having those discussions with governments about this is what we're doing to help this pocket, but we're in this side, we're going to need to improve what we deliver on this side into hepatology care or gastro care or endocrinology, who's going to be taking care of these patients. And that's not what happens at these types of meetings. And it's not something that I've formally been involved in before, where that comes from these meetings and goes to there. And whether or not that's the type of thing that Wilton Park get involved in, or that Jeff and the guys do, and Donna.
I'm sure that Wilton Park will get involved, and it's one of the reasons he's trying to get WHO to pay more attention, I think, with some success. That said, though, John Lennon famously said life is what happens while you're busy making other plans. And the incretin agonists, right? I mean, the belief had been, at least among most of the KOLs that I know and trust, that a GLP-GIP wasn't going to be nearly as good as a GLP-glucagon. And that might still be true. Survodutide looks like a better drug for this than tirzepatide. But tirzepatide looks really good. And in a world where most patients will have been on some form of incretin agonist before they ever get to a hepatologist, right? Because if they're obese, 1 out of every 8 Americans has seen a GLP at some point. And the more we understand that as a class of agents, that's capable of dealing with virtually everything that we care about in metabolic disease, those will get stepped earlier. I have a friend whose 33-year-old son who was a offensive lineman, Division I in college football, and those kids 10 years later, either they're massive and have massive health problems or they lost 100 pounds. He's in category A. His primary care physician put him on Ozempic. His mother thought that was a scandal. I thought that was absolutely necessary. I explained to her why. She's a good friend. But if primary care started to look at people who are diabetic or pre-diabetic and obese and saying, I'm not even going to worry about getting you to an endocrinologist. Let's get you on a GLP or eventually maybe a double G now. Then what's going to happen is we will see fewer people coming to hepatology in need now than would otherwise. So it's not quite like we're putting our foot on the hose and therefore the flow is going to stop, but we're slowing the flow so that you might be able to reduce the rate of growth in incoming at the same time that you're picking up the ability to handle incoming. And we don't get quite so I'm more optimistic about this than I was a year and a half ago. A year and a half ago, I just thought we were going to get swamped. But as I say, this tirzepatide phase 2b data is intriguing. Some of the work we've been doing outside of this podcast, I've been learning that some hepatologists still won't touch GLPs, but many will. And in that regard, Ken Kuzi's wish is coming to fruition in many instances. So my optimism is that we may be able to, by treating the broader sense of metabolic disease, instead of seeing the liver as the thing to treat, the liver becomes part of the complex. And if you treat the complex earlier, the liver doesn't get in so much trouble. I think that's a more realistic path forward, frankly.
Yep. And I think that was the whole session that Quentin and the female consultant was Lisa Lotte Glad from Copenhagen. She did a great one of tying in the comorbidities to the liver and where it was tied in with that. So you're right, absolutely.
That makes me feel a little more hopeful as I sit 6,000 miles away. But all right, anything? Anything else?
Much more of it than I have.
Not in the middle of the night. I keep, like I say, it's been a little demanding. We'll see what I can do tonight. I'm confident that I will get to see the late breaker, because it's at 8 o'clock in the morning here.
I'm flying at that time. They concentrated it. It just means that it's more difficult to attend when flight schedules over the weekend.
So you see everything else. I'll see the late breaker and we'll compare notes, okay? And here's Louise after this second conversation, which took place on Saturday, June 8th, after she got back to London, but mostly reflects the Friday meeting. And our review of Friday is with Louise. Louise is now back in London. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you very much. It's nice to be home. It's always nice to be away. It's nice to be with the liver community, but it's nice to be home with a cup of tea.
I miss the liver community. this week, and I totally understand that.
Yes, we missed you.
Then in a little bit, I'm going to be speaking with Sven Francque, who will talk about Friday and Saturday, since he was part of the CPG committee, which I think is Friday's big story. And he was the chair of the late breakers, which were pretty remarkable, actually. The tirzepatide and efruxifermin presentations were exceptional. I believe, although they're both phase 2b studies, that we are truly turning a corner right now. And when you take the CPG recommendations together, it's really interesting. So first of all, general impressions since we last spoke. You said you got to a couple of things on Friday, maybe.
I got to a couple of things on Friday for the first time.
We were texting during the CPG guidelines.
We were. Well, you and John and you and I. That I got the impression it was a really exciting meeting from everybody's standpoint. I think there were a few comments that different people had said about the fact that it started all about public health and the research content. And there was a couple of comments made to say that it was still all about p-values. And of course, a lot of public health research is often more qualitative rather than quantitative. And they thought that there might have been a bit more of that. And I'd heard that from several people. So it seemed to be a general consensus as we're moving into public health. They expected to see more qualitative rather than quantitative. And that particular focus on the academic p-value, the data, which I just thought was interesting because we obviously talk a lot about p-values here and the serious data, but I could understand where they were coming from. So it was interesting.
When you get into public health, right, you're fundamentally about consensus, opinion, and then legislators. And one of the things you learn about legislators is that they're all about data. You can't sell a feeling to a legislator because they're checking their polls. So you have to be able to show them in some way that's demonstrable, either that the policy decision is incontrovertible or that the people that matter are on the side of the decision that they want to make, one or the other. Take your pick. So I get that. What sessions did you make on Friday besides the CPG one that we were at that was so fascinating?
I listened to the nutrition one because I couldn't get in. With 5 minutes to go, they closed the door, which was really encouraging because lots of people were in that. And there was another 25 or 30 of us listening and watching online because it was a general discussion. And that was excellent. I went to the MASLD non-invasive posters that was presented by Jérôme Broussier. And we had heavyweights there. We had the Maya Thiel presentation from one of her colleagues. We had Alina Allen's colleague present. So we had a lot of heavyweights around this one. And I'll discuss a little bit more about one of the posters. Jean presented there. So this was a heavyweight session. And I did some of the earlier stuff on non-invasive technologies earlier in the room that Jérôme was presenting at, but so were some of the others. So I got to different things and dipped in and out of a lot. And then I was in the CPG session, which blew my mind. It's like the podcast has weaved its magic spell, and the leap of faith that I talk about and sometimes get shot down. We need evidence, but obesity is not going to stop driving. Diabetes isn't going to stop increasing. We need to take a leap of faith for liver disease. We did more than that yesterday with the CPG. So I was just so excited. So as we were talking to each other, I've never known anything like it.
I couldn't agree with you more, as you know. What's even more interesting, though, is to view that session in the context of what happened at the late breakers today.
Which I missed because I was flying back.
But the 2B on tirzepatide shows that, in fact, it has a significant impact on fibrosis, right? Maybe 25% in the placebo group on fibrosis, 50%, if I remember roughly. These are very rough numbers. I'm not looking at the paper. The paper published today in NEJM, New England Journal of Medicine, so you can find it easily enough. And Lilly actually put out a press release on it on Friday, but it kind of jumped the gun, which surprised me. But it demonstrated that tirzepatide had a significant effect. And then it showed a really powerful 96-week effect for efruxifermin, which suggested, I think, pretty clearly that the concerns about wear-off effects on FGF21s are not a thing that matters, or not a thing that we're going to wind up being concerned about at the end of the day, right? And then second, and beyond that, if you put those up against CPG, which suggested that under certain circumstances it may be appropriate to use drugs that aren't approved, or took into account drugs that aren't approved. So when they say you can't use tirzepatide for fibrosis, but you can use tirzepatide in diabetes and obesity, wink, wink, I think that's right. And one of the points that was made somewhere, I think this morning, is that you can only get tirzepatide paid for if you have diabetes. But even so, that's a large chunk of the MASLD population and the MASH population. So all things considered, Not bad.
Certainly, I did not expect the CPG to go where it was. And somebody asked me this morning why I was still in shock. I have never known a guideline come out approving medications and naming the medication, resmetirom, to be used in the MASLD field in a region that the drug is actually not approved in yet. So that is going ahead of, normally we would wait, we would get a bit of data, we would do it, and then we would review it because we've already published guidelines, and then they just have to be adapted. Never have I seen a guideline in any form of hepatology, and I may have missed a lot, I assure you, but I have never known a guideline pre-approve a drug for use that's published in advance of the drug being approved for use. So that is a leap of faith, beyond a leap of faith. But I'm dead excited about it because they also commented on lots of other drugs. Pioglitazone may not be useful for, it can't be recommended in fibrosis, but you can use it in. So they were more comprehensive in the medications. They might not be used for a specific area of MASLD, but they could be used in this way. And I think that's excellent when you're not a non-hepatology specialist.
Yeah.
But remember, this is the Society of Endocrinology and Obesity coming together with hepatology. And the only thing I can think as a title for this is hepatometabolic health. Not liver disease, not obesity, not endocrinology, but this is more the overall health. Because where you look at the non-invasive list of cutoffs, they've nailed FibroScan at 248, which is the meta-analysis score. And remember, a lot of people now are not going to be biopsied.
Right.
So all of the grades for fibrosis normally that you put with FibroScan is when you've got a confirmed diagnosis.
Right.
So where I know somebody's got alcoholic-related liver disease, I use the cutoffs for alcoholic. And on the new EchoSense liver management platform, you can pull down each guideline to change the score and to change the reports, for example. So they've allowed that leeway. But for meta-analysis for people with steatosis, that 248 is based on, I think, 4,500, nearly 5,000 liver biopsies of all cause. So I was interested to see that because a lot of the abstracts that I read throughout the conference use different cutoffs. And when we talk about MASLD and MASH, we tend to talk about cutoffs of over 280. Some go into the 300s, but we have to put it in the context that we are definitely looking for somebody who's going to, on a biopsy, fulfill criteria for a clinical trial. But give me somebody with a cap of 249, 250, 260 now in their early 20s. We can now start to manage them with this type of guideline, which offers the opportunity to get in early, prevent and manage lifestyle to prevent diabetes and obesity potentially, or slow it down. And that's where I come into now about, and have done for the last few years, as you know, about liver health is the issue and the comorbid situation, and liver disease is the end stage to start early. And this CPG really, really, for me, delivers that potential. Will we see that roll down to the international countries themselves? I'm sure the UK will look at it, and we certainly have to do our guidelines. They were written in 2015. But yeah, you couldn't have asked for anything more. In fact, I certainly wasn't expecting as much as it delivered. So well done to everybody in that.
So first of all, my sense is that was a prod to the individual countries, right? Because not only is it a guideline, but it's a guideline from 3 societies, and they didn't talk about any drugs that aren't covered for diabetes. So that was my first thought. My second thought was wisdom morphs over time. And as often as I've quoted our friend Stephen as saying that liver is the canary in the coal mine, I think the way people are looking at this now, it's a little bit different. That in fact, metabolic disease is like the gray fog, and it's liver, and it's diabetes, and it's obesity. And while those are the diseases, the causes of death will be cardiovascular and extrahepatic cancers, obesogenic cancers, if you will. So the gray fog descends, and then eventually everything goes dark. And what liver has always been is the hardest element in the gray fog to define. Not necessarily the first sign, but the thing in the middle of that dark cloud that tells you that it's about to pour. And that's kind of how I took these guidelines and the organizations that put them together, because it was interesting when they did multi-organizations in the U.S., right? It was under the aegis of AGA, gastroenterologists, and included endocrinology, liver, primary care. This was a lot more metabolically focused, because if you think about the 3 major, if you will, I'm going to call them syndromes. I was taught a long time ago that the meaning of the word disease originally was all about pain, dis-ease, literally, uneasiness, right? pain. And that, in fact, a lot of what we're calling diseases aren't really in terms of you don't die from them, per se. Nobody died from obesity, per se, or from diabetes, per se, or from, MASH, per se, until it progresses to cirrhosis or liver or HCC. So it's this gray mass of cloudy conditions that collectively comprise a dark cloud that cover the individual landscape, and then you're just waiting to figure out what the rain or the lightning or the thunder is going to look like and where it's going to land. Those are the causes of death: cardiovascular, stroke, obesogenic cancer. But these three organizations coming together this way is, I think, a really fantastic acknowledgement of what's got to be done. I agree with what you said about what they recommended was massive, but the group of people that they put together to do it, I also thought was different than the states and massive in its own way.
And their guidelines previously hadn't gone as far as, we've got to take the previous combined guidelines in the context that was several years ago, and where we've developed with liver disease, non-invasive technologies, biomarkers, and medications in that timeline has basically developed at speed. And I know it takes a lot of time to get trials to develop at speed at the end, and all of a sudden they come in. So I was, as you know, very happy about that. And
I know we were texting, I noticed.
But I think the overall conference, I got the sense that it was building to something. Everybody was excited. Everybody enjoyed it. So, yeah.
Alexander was certainly suggesting that the week before. I am immensely impressed with him. His energy, his enthusiasm, his vision, and his finesse, all that. He was massively enthusiastic the week before. And now he's always an enthusiastic guy, but I wondered if there wasn't something more behind it. And because I knew what was in the late breakers at that point in time, because we had gotten them, they were embargoed, but we'd gotten them because journalists, I knew that tirzepatide and fruxafermin were going to show up. So I've been having conversation with people in the States, some of whom were clients and some of whom were friends, about what they're now calling the GGs and the GGGs are going to mean for Madrigal and really the mainstream oral drugs, right? Because the question now is there a pincer movement or not? The pincer movement would be people going on incretins of some form or another in the first place, or if they're really severe, going on the FGF21s. And then in the middle, you've got Resdifra, you've got lanifibranor, you have all the THR betas as they show up. And those are kind of middle of the road drugs. Part of me says that squeezes the middle. And part of me says that as long as you have 60% GI side effects with tirzepatide and what the FGF21s are going to cost, that it's going to look more like what Stephen used to suspect would happen, which was oncology, right? Acute treatment and then maintenance. And on maintenance, everybody works their way to Madrigal because it's safe and they're not going to get worse. So when I look at the big picture, those are the two sweeps I see in terms of the drugs. Do you have any sense about which one of those it might be? I don't yet. I'm going to ask a lot of people that question.
I don't, and I think my focus is more on the monitoring, the detection, rather than the sort of method of action and the type of drugs. We might move into the stage where we were with patients on hepatitis C. It's the right patient, right time, right drug. There are drugs, for example, that don't particularly lose weight. And in fact, one of them has a weight gain aspect. Now, I deal with lots of people who don't want to lose their curves. Lanifibranor them. They don't want to lose their curves. We don't need to put them on drugs that force the stereotypical weight loss. If they don't want to lose their curves, the potential is they can have a drug that may have a similar effect, but actually keep their body shape. So we get to the stage where we can individualize the drugs around what the patient's needs are and the way they feel. And I think having that portfolio of medications, everybody just assumes that we have to lose weight. We know these drugs can lose internal weight and not external weight. We did it with hepatitis, right time, right patient, right drug. A lot of it is about the patient. When is it suitable for them to go onto it? And we're going to know that with the fibrosis scores. But all of them having different actions and different ways, I think we can support a lot more. I think that's great. But I think it becomes part of the questioning. What drug would suit you best? Because we now have a portfolio. That would be a beautiful place to be for where we were when we started.
5 years from now, I think we'll be there.
Yeah, and 5 years from now, I think we will be there.
We've got a bunch of good 2Bs and 3s. Okay, so now let me jump over to devices, okay? Because at the same time that CAP is becoming more widely accepted and that EchoSense now says they can scan 96% of all people with BMIs over 30 accurately with the next generation product, which is what I'm seeing ads for or comments for. I'm hearing from other places comments that the holy grail is going to be in-office PDFF, that it's a better measure than CAP, and that if you can get in-office PDFF, that's the winner, or superior. How do you feel about that? I don't know how I feel, and you know a lot more about this and think about it a lot more than I do. How do you feel about that?
I think you have to make sure the surrogate of MRI-PDFF actually matches MRI-PDFF. And I think we've moved beyond the stage where we're going to biopsy enough people on non-invasive devices, because we're not biopsying, to get the data that MRI-PDFF have, or MRI, and FibroScan. There's over 4,800 publications, and that's before this this meeting. So where do these other devices get that biopsy data from? Because we've moved beyond the biopsy.
Oh, and they're huge, and that's going to explode.
So surrogate of a surrogate, how do you prove it? And I think for Office at PDFF.
All right. So if I had a PDF in-office PDFF device, I wouldn't even worry about biopsy. I would use the nail NIT logic. I would go past that, and I would simply try to match up to MRI PDFF.
But then you've got to match it, and you've got to prove it, and that takes a while. So I do think we'll get there, and that'll be great.
Well, so question number one is that a commercially viable goal? So if you look at what's coming up right now to compete with the EchoSense, you get companies that say they can do better caps or easier caps, or not get a more reliable cap score, but fundamentally match the FibroScan score and do it in ways that are either economically or logistically favorable. And then you have companies coming up that are going to bet on in-office PDFF.
I suppose my question would be, from the scientific perspective, you might match the cap of EchoSense, but do you match the liver tissue that cap matches for EchoSense? Those are two different questions. And one comes with biopsy data.
And I'm sure EchoSense will ask that question a lot.
Yeah, but that would be what Jean would ask me. Those are two different questions. One you might say, but you can't prove. I'm not the scientists behind this. For me, it's about, if you're going to use an MRI PDFF in an office, that's going to be with a physician. Mm-hmm. The VCTE with EchoSense, whether you look at a hepatoscope, whether you look at all of the other devices being brought in, the data isn't there yet. That doesn't mean it won't be there to say that it can be in the next CPGs, because of course they were very descriptive on VCTE or other blood-based biomarkers. No other device I saw in the guidelines that I've read, and they weren't discussed on the screen. That doesn't mean that won't develop, but the evidence at the moment isn't there. And I think we'll progress with the evidence, which will be good. But a PDFF machine will be a physician use, and it'll be in one office, probably because of cost. Rather like the initial FibroScan machines and the initial machines of any of these, they're quite expensive. Therefore, you tend to put them in the central hospital area so that people get. So I think it depends on how they're rolled out. I think the opportunities are there to get more evidence if we're going to be finding more patients. But I think it is going to come down to the evidence. Yes, I use FibroScan, but FibroScan was I've used since 2006, 2007, because it was the first and only. So I didn't have the luxury that we now have in this armory that is potentially come out. But it is all about the evidence, and that's the key.
So your point is an interesting one, which is what this might come down to in the end is whether A, regulatory agencies, and B, guideline organizations, and C, physicians will require a match back to liver tissue, or whether they will say, if you're sufficiently highly correlated with the non-biopsy tool that exists, we will accept that.
I don't, and I'm not making those decisions. I just operate the devices at the end of it.
I hear you.
And those may be totally different devices in 5, 10, 15 years. We don't know where we're going. But at the moment, I just use the one that I've used for nearly 18 years.
Okay.
So it's that, but that doesn't mean there's the evidence establishes, and I'm sure their machines will upgrade, and the new guided VCTE has lots of positive benefits. That's the development of technology. I use different technologies, but I more think about where can we use them for patient benefit? How can they be used? But I do lots of things, paracentesis clinics, things like that, where I've developed those pathways. It's just part of what nurses will do, venesection to help. We look at the way we can utilize technologies for liver at the coalface with patients and develop pathways to support our physician colleagues in delivering the best care to patients.
And with that, let's say goodbye to our audience for now. So welcome back to England.
It's nice to be back. But Milan was lovely. It was autumn temperatures in Perth. 28 in the day and 18 at night, which is what I left at Perth in the late autumn, early winter.
Oh, that's gorgeous. That's gorgeous. That's gorgeous. So it almost felt like you hadn't left.
Exactly.
Excellent. Okay. The final conversation in this episode was with EASL education counselor, CPG committee member, and late breaker co-host, our good friend, Sven Francque. Sven and I spoke 90 minutes after the final gavel for the conference. Hi, so we're here with Sven Francque. Sven, congratulations on an amazing conference. At first, I want to congratulate you on a fantastic meeting, and you were part of the two big events, which we'll talk about, the CPG guidelines and then the late breaker session. But how did you find the general mood of the meeting? How did it feel in Milan?
It really felt like a vibrant hepatology community. I mean, there was a lot of very interesting stuff, both in terms of new science presented, an excellent postgraduate course, basic science symposium. So So I think there was really a lot to discover and very interesting content, but also the ambience was really, really nice. It really felt like a vibrant hepatology community with a lot of interaction, networking. Walking around the conference center, you felt the positive ambience, and people were in a way happy to be there and part of the meeting and participate and absorb not only all the content but also interact with each other. Yeah, it felt very well. Yeah, it was really a nice experience.
Well, it felt really engaging and powerful from over here. Even the energy made it all the way from Milano to Pennsylvania, which is great.
Well, then it must be very strong.
It was quite strong. Let's tackle a couple of things one at a time. Okay, first of all, I know you're part of the committee that wrote the CPG guidelines. I believe, and the people I've spoken with believe, that they were fantastic and bold and badly needed. What do you believe was the most compelling part about the guidelines, or how they were put together, or the overall message they deliver?
There are several elements, First of all, I think the important thing is that we based it on the new nomenclature. And to me, the most important thing there is that we clearly state that for those chronic problems, you need to look at all potential risk factors for chronic liver disease. It's metabolic, of course, pointing towards the root cause of this disease topic in the CPG, but you have to have a broad vision and a holistic approach in that sense. Another point is that, again, as the 2016 guideline, it was a collaborative effort with 3 societies. It's another way of pointing out that this needs a holistic approach and that the liver is embedded in, but also a motor of metabolic abnormalities. Another element, I think, is that we were quite more pronounced on what to do in terms of case finding and how to do it. And then also in terms of treatment, we emphasize the need for a multidisciplinary treatment. We tackle what can already be done with currently available drugs, not specifically licensed for MASLD, MASLD, but still useful in that population within their proper indications. And we already incorporate also the fact that resmetirom is FDA approved, accelerated approval, and we incorporated that already in the guidelines. So it's a little bit future-proof, I would say.
So it makes the guidelines something that people can use in a year or two. I think that's wise. I think that's a very wise thing to have done. Did you get any pushback on any of the items that you just talked about, or were there areas of tremendous debate while the guidelines were coming together that you're comfortable discussing at a high level?
There were for sure areas of debate, yes, but that's, I think, also the added value of doing this together with 3 societies and have the view of the different specialties that have to take care of people living with this disease. The issue that I mentioned about case finding and how to do it was for sure something that has been debated. The guideline is in line with the other guidelines, but is a little bit more granular, as it does not stick to one threshold, but it uses a rule in and a rule out threshold. You could go for a more simplified version with just one threshold. It's a little bit more granular than that.
So certainly CPG was one of the major important elements of the conference. Another was a lot of work on drugs. And as the guy who co-chaired the late breaker session, I would love for you to comment on, first of all, the 2 drugs that were mentioned there, the 2 MASH drugs that were mentioned there, tirzepatide, efruxifermin, and then on some of the others that were in the general session or that you thought had really interesting work presented, or resmetirom for that matter, actually.
If we first take the things that were discussed today at the late breaker, of course, you have tirzepatide, quite impressive results. The MASH resolution result is, of course, very impressive, also clear dose-dependent effect. The results on fibrosis are a little bit puzzling. Also looking at the publication that came available, numerically you also see clear effects, but there, of course, you have the different ways of presenting it, with including patients that have dropped out for several reasons. And it's a little bit puzzling that there is no dose-dependent effect there, although there seems numerically to be an effect. So the small numbers would tend us to not overemphasize, but anyhow, this is encouraging. I mean, having 50% regression of fibrosis compared to placebo with, according to the interpretation, 25 or 30%, still it makes a huge difference. And with all the caution with the low numbers and the way the data are analyzed and presented. Still, it should also be puzzling if you have such a powerful effect on MASH. It would be puzzling if you don't have an effect on fibrosis in terms of fibrosis regression. So I think this is something that in a phase 3 trial will be well established.
So that's tirzepatide, and then is efruxifermin also, right?
Yeah, efruxifermin. So the 96-week data that Vlad has presented, I think that's also very interesting. I mean, there are several interesting aspects there. First of all, you see that patients that on drug treatment had a response on week 24, they maintained that response, which was not the case with all the placebo patients that had a response. Some of them lost the response on the long term, so the 96 weeks. That's the first important observation. A second important observation to me was that, of course, you added a number of patients that have a treatment response with longer treatment. So longer treatment results in more patients achieving the response in terms of fibrosis regression and also MASH resolution. Although it was also interesting to see that the majority of responders is still already occurring quite early. So in the first 24 weeks, already a lot of responders are responders. And you add more responders with longer treatment, but still more than half of the responders is in the first 24 weeks of treatment, which is also interesting to see in terms of understanding the dynamics of the disease and whether we observe is MASH resolution and subsequent fibrosis regression or some direct fibrosis effect. You cannot really tell from the data, but at least it suggests that there might be some direct antifibrotic effects explaining that still the majority of patients with a response are occurring in the first 24 weeks of treatment.
Interesting you should say that, because Vlad made a comment in response to a question today where the question was about level of fibrosis regression versus level of MASH resolution. And his answer was, well, maybe there's direct fibrotic effect. So that's now you saying the same thing for a second reason. That's fascinating.
Yeah, sure.
So I want to go back to a couple of things. Number one, how exciting it is that we've seen so many drugs come through different modes of action come through phase 2 here.
Yes, absolutely. And also because some of the data are quite convincing. Again, we should be cautious with the interpretation of the data because sometimes it's low numbers. The way people that drop out for any reason during the trial and don't have their end of trial biopsy are handled also has an impact on the precise figures that we see. So some caution is always needed with the interpretation of this kind of phase 2 data. But anyhow, you see impressive results on MASH resolution. You see results that are quite suggestive of a clear effect on fibrosis also. And then we have also the previous data with lanifibranor also showing a strong antifibrotic effect in 24 weeks time. So there are a lot of potential drugs in the pipeline, and we'll see with phase 3, but still this seems to be quite encouraging to have after the phase 3 trials, different compounds available with different modes of action, which then offers avenues to care more patients because there are always non-responders. So there might be treatment options for non-responders to drug A with drug B or combination treatments. It's not for tomorrow, of course, because we have to do all the work with the phase 3 trials. But still, it means that now the field is really moving and that there is at least some potential that within a few years we will have different treatment opportunities to combine or to have alternative treatments if patients are not responding. We're not there yet to have clear indicators of what would be the ideal population for drug A compared to drug B. That is still something we need to work on.
So Sven, it's just my personal experience when you describe exactly what you just did. I first met this disease about 5 years ago at NASH-TAG 2019. And at that point in time, there were 2 drugs that had spotty phase 2s going into phase 3, and we were hopeful. But people were optimistic, but a lot of that was wish and hope. And the question was, how do we get fibrosis down one level in a clinical trial? We're now 5 years later. We have a drug on the market. We have some clearly affirmative phase 2s that have answered some interesting questions. One of the interesting things to me about the efruxifermin 96-week data was that pegbelfermin was promising initially and then fell back over time, which was why it failed. This obviously isn't going to happen here. So you look 5 years forward and you can see several approved drugs, I think, I hope.
That's a realistic thing, yeah. it's a realistic thing. I think some of the results of the earlier phase 2 trials, and that's always the caveat with phase 2 trials, large numbers and the way data are presented. Some of the phase 2 trials that were positive, they were positive, of course, but the results were not always as compelling as the results we see now. But that's also the way it progresses, and what we have seen with other diseases. In the beginning, you see small effect sizes and you are happy, and then you get better and better drugs with larger and larger effect sizes. I mean, that's how it goes.
That's what comes next. Also, there was a lot of mention in CPG about ways to use NITs to classify patients, and some NIT work in the meeting itself. Is there anything you'd like to comment on that front?
The interesting thing, I think, is that there are two studies about, they're not completely the same, but two studies about the prognostic value of liver stiffness. And I think that is one of the important ways to go, and one of the gaps that we have today is how to link changes in NITs over time with the prognosis of the patient. And in particular, that study with Vincent Wong, I think, as last author, about changes in liver stiffness, in this case with VCTE, 30% up or down, that evolution is quite predictive of prognosis of the patient. And I think that is, to me, one of the main progress we are starting to make in terms of the interpretation and working with NITs. It's a better understanding of what their evolution over time can tell us. And I don't think we're completely there yet, because it's not always as accurate on an individual patient base, but still, I think it's an important piece of the puzzle that we were missing and that we are step by step discovering.
Okay, so is there anything else about the content of the meeting that we've not covered yet that you'd like to speak about for a moment or two?
MASLD, I think these are really the most important issues. Another interesting observation was also, and it's a little bit broader than MASLD, it's SLD. It was a presentation by Mats Israelsen from Alexander Krag's group about how over time patients people can switch from one category to another, and that some of the MASLD patients after a re-evaluation weren't MASLD anymore or were MET ALD and vice versa, showing how dynamic that classification potentially is. There are two caveats there. First of all, the diagnosis of steatosis was based on CAP, and we know that CAP, especially in terms of precisely quantifying steatosis, is probably not always as accurate. It's especially not in follow-up. So it needs also, I think, another modality of diagnosing steatosis to confirm these data. And then, of course, alcohol was self-reported, so that's also a caveat. But nevertheless, it shows you how dynamic it is and how important it is to really take into account, not just cross-line diagnostically, but also in follow-up of patient, how different factors that cause steatotic liver disease, whether it's alcohol or cardiometabolic risk factors, can evolve over time, and those evolutions over time also impact on the liver. And so the history of that will also be important if we assess a patient. But otherwise, I think we covered not everything, but the most important highlights. We did not specifically talk about survodutide, but also there you have results that are a little bit comparable with tirzepatide.
Or maybe even a little bit stronger, we'll see. But yes, and I think it was exciting that both different modalities of double incretin agonists both showed successful results. I think people were always confident about GLP-glucagon, less so about GLP-GIP. So I thought tirzepatide in that regard was good news, really good news.
Yeah, indeed. But with the caveats that I mentioned. Yeah.
So, Sven, thanks for joining us today. And we've been through a lot. I'm sure you're pretty tired by now. So thanks again for joining today.
Fine.
And now, here's Roger with this week's question of the week.
And here's our question of the week. One of the themes that Louise identified and that the practice guidelines address is the need for primary care to play a pivotal role in diagnosis and treatment of metabolic diseases, including SLD, starting within the next 5 years, maybe sooner. What kinds of support and education must we provide for primary care to step into this role? How long do you anticipate it will take for them to do so?
And now for the Season 5, Episode 19 Business Report.
Slava Ukraini, glory to Ukraine. Heroyam Slava, glory to heroes. And also Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel live. As the EU and U.S. rush to get more aid to Ukraine as quickly as possible, in part to make up for the U.S.'s delay last winter and spring, let's stop for a minute to remember and respect the brave Ukrainian fighters and residents. Similarly, as we learned that Hamas's military wing would rather sacrifice civilians than agree to a peace proposal backed by the UN Security Council and reportedly accepted by Israel, let's take time to be thankful for the 4 hostages returned to Israel safely last week. Remember and wish for the safe and speedy return of the many remaining Israeli hostages, and to remember and pray for safety for the Gazan residents whose needs are poorly served by their government's approach to the situation. Heroyam Slava, glory to heroes, and also Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel live.
The next month of episodes is dedicated to key lessons from the EASL Congress.
As I said at the beginning of the episode, this starts our post-EASL coverage arc. We plan 1 episode on drug development, 1 on the new clinical practice guidelines, 1 on the Healthy Livers, Healthy Lives Initiative, and perhaps 1 or 2 more on topics you want us to cover. I said all that at the top of the interview, and I also said, please let us know what you'd like to hear, and we'll see if we can get it arranged.
We've sent more invitations to join the Surfing MASH community this past week. Thanks for your responses.
We've sent another 100 or so invitations to Surfing MASH LinkedIn followers in the past week while holding the same 30% enrollment rate in the community. Next week, we'll start on my first level contacts we've not reached previously. That should take another few weeks. Not to bore you, but the benefits, as I mentioned previously, include our weekly newsletter, which now is its 6th episode, audience invitations for real-time listening, which will start with our next studio episode, and office hours, which will start next week. One more point, we had a dramatic uptick in enrollments right after EASL. Thanks to those of you who want to hear what we and our guests have to say. I hope we don't disappoint you.
We don't have a vault episode this week, but we're replacing it with something special.
Okay, we don't have a vault, but we do have a special surprise for you. A segment from my second conversation with Louise that we cut so that we can keep the whole episode to a reasonable length. See what you think. That's it for this week. I want to thank our team, Jorn, Louise, Mike, Eric, Steve, as we keep moving forward. I want to thank the team at EASL Walter Cruz, who did so much to help. And Walter, if I mispronounce your last name, please forgive me. And I want to thank Mike Betel, who was an invaluable help through this campaign and through the Congress. Please take a listen to our question of the week. Of course, reply. If you're a LinkedIn follower, check your email or messages for an invitation to subscribe to our weekly piece. We'll be back next week with 1 of the EASL episodes. Until then, stay safe, surf on. Bye-bye now.
Have any questions for the surfers? You can send them to questions@surfingmash.com and we will answer on the podcast or website. Your question might even wind up being the question of the week.